Now, how did it get to this point where the population is in such bad shape, where the people are so demoralized, where the societies become so degenerate, where the very idea of economic progress doesn't stir anybody, it doesn't mean anything to anybody? And this is a process that's been going on for over 100 years. And this is a process that began around 1900 with a total assault on the idea of progress, with a total assault on the concept of man. And at the beginning of the 1900s, there was tremendous optimism in the world because of what had happened in the United States during the Civil War and following the Civil War. There was an industrial revolution that occurred, a total economic transformation that nobody in the world had ever seen, on a scale nobody had ever seen. And the amount of product that could be created, the amount of physical wealth that could be created, could provide the kind of living standard where people for the first time had a quality of life, or the beginnings of a quality of life, where they could actually take time to think, to study, to develop. And this was the beginning of what people call the middle class. And the middle class is a completely new phenomenon in history. And there was tremendous excitement about spreading this industrial revolution to Europe, to Asia, to the whole world. And everyone at that time was very excited about the scientific developments that were going on. There was tremendous optimism in the population at that time, not just in the United States, but in the world, about what was possible. And the singular most important person who organized this radical shift, his name is Bertrand Russell. And he was born in 1870, died in, he died in he was born in 1872, and he died in 1970. And what he did has completely, is pure evil genius. What he did is he launched an attack on science itself. Through the use of the British Empire's power, he was able to promote the idea that you could reduce mathematics to logic, logical systems. And then he used that to go after science. And what happened is that after a long time of this, most of the population does not know the difference between logic and reason. Reason is not logic. Human beings do not think in a logical form. Logical forms are the way computers are programmed. Human beings do not think logically. But people have this misconception that that's what thinking is. It's not. There is no thinking in logic. And so what happens is that the population does not develop a culture which promotes the kind of thinking, like the kind of thinking that Socrates has in Plato's dialogues, which is the actual form in which thinking actually takes place, is in the form of a dialogue. So we have a destruction of that whole process, so that the population does not have confidence in their own thinking, and they're presented with this view that they are not, since they are not logicians, they have not developed the power of logic, that therefore they're not qualified to think. They're not experts. They don't know anything. Well, it's true. A lot of people don't know anything, but the process of thinking is not about how much you know. It's a process of discernment. It's a process of asking questions. It's a process of asking, well, does this make any sense? Does that make any sense? What could it be? Since it doesn't make any sense, what else could it be? Why isn't it this way? Why is it that way? That's the kind of thinking that we used to have a culture where everybody was thinking that way. It was a classical culture based on classical music, classical poetry, classical drama. We don't have that anymore. The culture is totally based on some sensation, on feeling. It's based on catharsis. It's based on experience. It's not based on thinking. We don't have a culture for thinking people anymore. We only have a culture, and this is all Bertrand Russell's doing. And he did this because he was a representative of the aristocracy, trying to defend itself against the Industrial Revolution and future revolutions that would have come from the Industrial Revolution. And those future revolutions in technology and science were the revolutions that would have elevated the most backward peasants of humanity to the level of being far more intellectually developed than the average aristocrat. And that was what Russell was opposed to. So he went after science itself. He went after the method of thinking in the population in general as well. And he teamed up with H.G. Wells in something called the Open Conspiracy, which promoted the idea of dumbing down the population by destroying the language, eliminating classical music and replacing it with rock-type music, of introducing drugs to destroy the willpower of the population, to destroy the population. And only those people who were designated to be the rulers, the ruling class, would actually have a different education than creating compliance, conformity, an education that discouraged initiative, and so forth. Now, what he meant by science, of the scientific ruling class, he meant developing the power to control through biology, through psychology, through drugs, different kinds of methods to control populations. Because the aristocracy, the oligarchy, was done for. The Industrial Revolution and subsequent industrial revolutions were the end of this. So now, in the meantime, they launched these conferences. So in the meantime, you had World War I, World War II, the Cold War. These wars kept nations from coming together for the kind of development that would have alleviated the poverty, would have alleviated the conditions. The idea was to prevent Europe, the economic power of Europe and the United States, from developing the Eurasia, Africa, Latin America. That was the issue. Now, that was what Franklin Roosevelt intended to do, but he died, and Truman came in, and Truman followed the advice of Churchill, who was influenced very heavily by Bertrand Russell, to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this act began. Now, what Bertrand Russell saw back in the beginning of the century, you had Einstein, the Curies, and others developing the concept of a new force of energy, nuclear, the forces of the nucleus, which supersedes the chemical energies. And this nuclear force is the future. It's the future that will allow us to do the things we can't do now. And we've only partly gone into it, and we haven't gone to where we need to go with nuclear power. Now, what Bertrand Russell did was he put forward an orientation in an article he wrote to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a 6-page article on October 1st, 1946. He laid out the strategy that's still running the world today. He launched 3 movements simultaneously. One of the movements was to get the United States convinced to use nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union could develop those weapons, to force them into a world government. His view was that you could not stop the ultimate destruction of humanity through nuclear war unless there was a world government over all of humanity, which is not true. And he said to make that world government, the United States needs to launch a nuclear attack on Russia, destroy the Soviet Union before they could develop, or if they don't submit to a world government. Then he launched simultaneously a second movement. In the event that the Soviet Union developed it, then there had to be a movement to convince the Soviets to become partners in a world government with the West. And the third was he launched a ban-the-bomb pacifist movement, anti-nuclear movement, which the hysteria of that movement used to confuse people between nuclear fission, commercial use of nuclear fission, and the nuclear weapons. So people were terrified of nuclear weapons. So they became terrified of nuclear power. And he played a major role in using the Cuban Missile Crisis as a way of terrorizing particularly my generation, which at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we all were facing the elimination of the human species, the children and young adolescents did not have the emotional way to deal with this, and they were profoundly psychologically deeply disturbed by this, including myself. And so as Kennedy was killed and the Vietnam War was beginning, we had no sense of a viable future. All we knew was that at any moment there would be a nuclear war and we would all get wiped out. And we were not mature enough to be able to have the defenses against that terror. And that became the governing terror of our society, of our population since then. To the point that people forgot about the future. The future doesn't exist. You only live for today. And that's how things have been run. And we're still in that mode. We are facing nuclear war now. The age of nuclear terror has not come to an end. Back in 1970, in the late 70s and early 80s, LaRouche launched a campaign to end the nuclear terror by getting the U.S. and the Soviet Union to work together on developing the technologies to defend nations against nuclear war, to end the mutually assured destruction nuclear terror, which Russell played a very key role in creating the concept of maintaining permanent terror as a way of maintaining permanent peace. And this has been the most corrosive and eroding of the psychology of the population. This is why you have a society which has no longer any connection to a future. They've lost that connection to a future. But China, Russia, India, even the people of Latin America and Africa, as horrible as they have been subjected to colonialism and looting, they want this future that we have rejected. And for that reason, a nuclear war is being set up against those nations by the power elites, with the support of, at least spiritual support, of a large portion, if not a majority, of the people who are going to be watching this. Why? Because you have no sense of a future. And what right have these people, the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, have to go to nuclear power, go to fusion power, go into space, develop, become far more prosperous than we could ever dream of becoming? What right do they have to do that? We're drowning in our own depressed degeneracy. And what right do they have to do that? Who do they think they are? So spiritually, we as a people will support the nuking of Russia and China. Whether you realize that or not, you are spiritually inclined to that unless you can locate in yourself that spirit of Bertrand Russell, who hated the human race. And I'm going to quote you something from Bertrand Russell. I'm going to end this by quoting something from Bertrand Russell. Glasses. Yeah, I'm going to quote Bertrand Russell here. I hate the world and almost all the people in it. How much would it do if one could exterminate the human race? I have been merely oppressed by the weariness and tedium and vanity of things lately. Nothing stirs me. Nothing seems worth doing or worth having done. The only thing I strongly feel worthwhile would be to murder as many people as possible so as to diminish the amount of consciousness in the world. Now, this guy, with the backing of the power of this empire, his spirit is alive in most of the people today in the most negative sense. There is no joy. in the future of mankind in the U.S., in the North American and European populations. But there is such a joy and commitment in those parts of the world which have not been, which have resisted, for whatever reason, cultural or otherwise, this kind of horrible, evil kind of emotion, which is now dominating our nation and its people on the deepest level. And I'm calling on everybody to locate that in themselves. It's not something, it's not the other person that has this problem. Locate this in yourself. And I recommend that everyone begin to shift their cultural orientation to classical music and to get connected politically to a different orientation for mankind than the doom that we're all trying to avoid talking about or thinking about. And at the beginning of the 1900s, there was tremendous optimism in the world because of what had happened in the United States during the Civil War and following the Civil War. There was an industrial revolution that occurred, a total economic transformation that nobody in the world had ever seen, on a scale nobody had ever seen. And the amount of product that could be created, the amount of physical wealth that could be created, could provide the kind of living standard where people for the first time had a quality of life, or the beginnings of a quality of life, where they could actually take time to think, to study, to develop. And this was the beginning of what people call the middle class. And the middle class is a completely new phenomenon in history. And there was tremendous excitement about spreading this industrial revolution to Europe, to Asia, to the whole world. And everyone at that time was very excited about the scientific developments that were going on. There was tremendous optimism in the population at that time, not just in the United States, but in the world, about what was possible. And the singular most important person who organized this radical shift, his name is Bertrand Russells. And he was born in 1870, died in, he died in he was born in 1872 and he died in 1970. And what he did has completely, is pure evil genius. What he did is he launched an attack on science itself. Through the use of the British Empire's power, he was able to promote the idea that you could reduce mathematics to logical systems. And then he used that to go after science. And what happened is that after a long time of this, most of the population does not know the difference between logic and reason. Now, how did it get to this point where the population is in such bad shape, where the people are so demoralized, where the societies become so degenerate, where the very idea of economic progress doesn't stir anybody, doesn't mean anything to anybody? And this is a process that's been going on for over 100 years. And this is a process that began around 1900 with a total assault on the idea of progress, with a total assault on the concept of man. And